There exists a place beneath the heart of Rome where only a chosen few may pass, not to pray or worship, but to keep watch. Behind 3 layers of heavy iron doors, beyond silent corridors and echoless walls, lies a vault so secretive that most of the world will never know what truly rests inside. This is not a museum. It is not a library. It is not a place where knowledge is shared. It is where it is hidden. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, often misunderstood as merely secret, is not called so because of conspiracies, but because of its design, to protect. Inside this colossal repository lie over 1,000 years of memory sealed away in quiet darkness. Letters written by popes that were never sent. Records of visions dismissed by church authorities. Documents of conversations with emperors, fascists, and even intelligence agencies. Works of art never shown. Decisions never explained. Truths never told. Most of humanity will never enter this place. But once, a man did. He was not a cardinal, nor a bishop, nor even a scholar. He was a custodian, a simple caretaker whose duty was to clean, record, and occasionally deliver select documents to approved researchers. He had no noble bloodline, no official authority, and no reason to be remembered. But on quiet nights, as the oil lamp flickered and the elders drifted into slumber, he wandered. Past the lines he was not meant to cross, toward doors that were not meant to open. He doesn't claim to be a hero. He does not seek to expose, condemn, or rewrite the past. He simply wants someone, somewhere, to understand before the last breath leaves his body. His hands shake now when they touch the same parchment that once felt familiar as skin. His eyes fade in candlelight. His time is short, but what he saw must not die with him. Among the first things he uncovered were the unsent letters of Pope Pius XII. They lay quietly in an unlabeled drawer, drafts never dispatched, words never spoken aloud. Nearby, he found forbidden volumes once placed on the church's list of condemned books. He stood before paintings attributed to Caravaggio, hidden for centuries not because they lacked beauty, but because they revealed emotions the church could not face. Eyes in those portraits looked not toward heaven, but into something far more human: pain. And in these discoveries, one realization began to crystallize. The things locked away were not buried because they were false. They were hidden because they were true. Too true for a world not ready to face them. He doesn't expect to be believed. He cannot present proof that governments or media would accept. But he believes that if even one person listens, truly listens, someone who still feels that behind every golden altar and chanted prayer lies something unresolved, then perhaps his purpose is fulfilled. Because one day, these doors will open, and when they do, the world may finally understand why he could never go back. Most people think the Vatican is simply a religious capital, a place of sacred ritual, where popes wave from balconies and prayers rise into the Roman sky. But that's only the surface. Beneath the marble floors and beside the towering stone walls lies something else, a sovereign state with its own laws, secrets, and mechanisms. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, is, by every measure, one of the most heavily guarded reservoirs of knowledge in existence. Its official name in Latin is Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. The word secretum doesn't mean secret in the way modern minds imagine. It means private. These are the Pope's personal records, not the church's, not the public's. And yet, that privacy has inspired centuries of speculation fear, and fascination. With more than 85 kilometers of shelving and over 35,000 archival entries, it contains everything from the 8th century onward. But only a small fraction is available to scholars, and even less to the public. The most classified materials, the ones that never leave their locked chambers, remain off-limits, even to most cardinals. Inside these inner vaults are documents that hold the weight of civilizations. One of the earliest discoveries the caretaker made was a letter from Galileo Galilei to the Church, dated 1613. In it, Galileo pleaded that his support for heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun, did not contradict Scripture. Yet in 1616, the Church declared heliocentrism heretical. Galileo was tried in 1633 by the Inquisition, an institution whose transcripts are also hidden deep within these walls. One particularly chilling document was the long-lost Pergamentum Chignon, a parchment once thought destroyed. Found in 2001, it revealed that Pope Clement V had actually absolved the Knights Templar in secret, even as the Church publicly condemned them to death. This one discovery shattered centuries of assumptions and proved that beneath the surface, the Vatican was often more complex and more divided than the world ever knew. The caretaker also found reports from the 20th century, hundreds of letters exchanged between the Holy See and Nazi Germany. The records show that the Vatican had early knowledge of the Jewish genocide. Some documents suggest a response constrained by fear, politics, and the need to protect its own followers. In 2020, after decades of debate, the Vatican finally opened part of its archives relating to Pope Pius XII. The documents revealed a nuanced picture. Pius did not remain entirely silent during the Holocaust, but he chose discretion over confrontation. Some argue that his quiet efforts saved thousands. Others say his silence allowed evil to thrive. The truth, like much within the archives, is complicated. The caretaker also uncovered relics unrelated to religion, handwritten letters from Michelangelo, sketches by Bernini, a farewell from Mary, Queen of Scots, before her execution. A letter from a Native American chief, written in the 1800s, asking for spiritual protection during colonization. These are not fairy tales. They are history, untouched, unfiltered, and utterly human. But perhaps the most powerful experience came not from reading, but from standing. Standing before endless rows of shelves, each lined with trembling ink on brittle paper, the weight of history hanging in the air, knowing that some of these words hadn't been read in centuries, that some might never be read again. In one sealed dossier, he found records relating to Christianity's greatest fracture, the schism between Catholicism and Protestantism. Handwritten notes revealed secret exchanges between Martin Luther and Vatican representatives. Once, they tried to reconcile, but pride, fear, and politics pulled them apart. In another file marked Inquisition, he found documents chronicling the torture and execution of heretics, men and women whose only crime was to question. Among them, the case of Giordano Bruno, a philosopher who believed the universe had no end. A cleric wrote, "If we spare him, doctrine will falter. If we kill him, history will never forgive us." Bruno was burned alive in 1600. The archives also documented the Vatican's relationship with secular empires. When Napoleon invaded Italy, he ordered the seizure of the most valuable Vatican texts. Thousands were sent to France. Many never returned. One note, written in fading charcoal by Pope Pius II, read simply, "We have been stripped bare." There were also files about the Vatican's interaction with distant powers. letters exchanged with Japan's Tokugawa shogunate, secret diplomacy with Asian empires, maps of dioceses that no longer exist, destroyed by war, disease, or silence. One floor plan from the 1200s showed an escape route beneath a monastery that was never officially documented. A final chance to flee, or perhaps a final illusion. The most politically charged section contained files on the Vatican's modern alliances during the Cold War with resistance groups in Eastern Europe. Documents revealed that the Church funded and supported Polish opposition movements, provided equipment, and exchanged intelligence. In Latin America, the archive showed Vatican complicity with authoritarian regimes. There were memos about kidnapped priests and murdered bishops. Sometimes, the Church remained silent. Other times, it protected dissidents in secret. It did not always choose justice, but it always remembered. Even the Vatican's own financial scandals are preserved. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, the death of God's banker, Roberto Calvi, and the internal memos warning that sacred funds were being misused. And yet, no corrections came in time. These are not stories of villains and saints. They are stories of human beings navigating impossible choices. They say silence is the Vatican's strongest voice. But what happens when that silence is broken? Not by words, but by what has been preserved. The Second Vatican Council was one of the most pivotal moments in modern church history. It wasn't just a gathering, it was a transformation. Thousands of pages buried in the archives reveal not only theological debates, but also the quiet wars fought behind closed doors. One debate in particular stands out: whether Mass should be celebrated in Latin or in local languages. A senior cardinal once said, "If we abandon Latin, we abandon eternity." Another countered, "If we don't change, we abandon the people." And there it was, a moment where the ancient collided with the evolving. Pages within the Vatican still hold an unpublished draft of a speech from Pope Paul VI. He had planned to issue a formal apology for the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust. The speech was never delivered. A single line in the margin read, "Tempus nondum est." The time has not yet come. And maybe that was always the Church's fear, not the confrontation of truth, but its timing. But if you turn the pages even deeper, past the golden icons and into the ash-gray folders marked by centuries, you'll find a section that cuts deeper than theology ever could. Colonialism. Faded documents, some nearly disintegrating, carry no open condemnation, no direct call to conquest. Yet hidden in the lines are echoes of complicity. In 1493, just a year after Columbus reached the New World, Pope Alexander VI issued a decree known as Inter Caetera. In it, the Church divided the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. With a crimson seal and formal Latin text, the Pope granted spiritual legitimacy to global empires. And beneath that legitimacy came the swords, the crosses, the ships, and the silence. Attached to that decree are correspondences between Rome and monarchs, Spain, Portugal, France, and Belgium, each one requesting the Pope's blessing to secure not just souls, but territory. Though cloaked in the language of faith, the reality was often exploitation and cultural annihilation. But not all voices were silent. Buried within those same folders is a letter from Father Bartolomé de las Casas to Pope Paul III. He described mass executions in the Caribbean, entire villages leveled, churches built on blood-soaked soil. His words weren't written in elegance. They were written in desperation. Nearby, preserved with eerie precision, lies a draft of the 1537 apostolic brief, Sublimis Deus. It declares that indigenous peoples are truly human and possess souls, that they should never be enslaved. A powerful, progressive document for its time. And yet, under pressure from colonial powers, it was withdrawn almost immediately, never implemented. But silence never means absence. The Vatican's presence in colonial lands continued, through missionaries, through diplomacy, through carefully worded letters that never crossed a line, but always implied one. A dense dossier marked India Missionary Affairs details French missionary efforts in Vietnam before colonial rule began. While these reports express concern for local Catholics under persecution, interspersed are chilling phrases: opportunity to expand influence, advantageous to Western merchants, language that blurs the line between salvation and strategy. As the 19th century approached, the Vatican's role shifted further into diplomacy. They weren't leading armies, but they were blessing them, not in direct orders, but in silence, not condemning injustice, but offering prayers and moving on. In one chilling document from 1885, a French bishop working in the Congo writes to the Vatican. He had witnessed villagers having their hands cut off for failing to meet rubber quotas under King Leopold II's reign. He pleaded for the Vatican to intervene. The reply? One line: we pray for them. But intervention is beyond reach. It's not a refusal, but it is a silence that speaks volumes. Still, the Vatican was not just a passive observer of history. In the Cold War, its hands were deep in the workings of diplomacy. Inside one of the most secure sections of the archives, rarely accessed even by seasoned scholars, are records of its involvement in shaping global power balances from the 1950s onward. One particularly revealing file is labeled simply Poland, 1970s. Within are letters, telegrams, and internal reports chronicling the Church's clandestine support for the Solidarity movement. A handwritten memo by Cardinal Casaroli reads, "This is not just a defense of faith, it is a matter of survival." The Vatican sent not just prayers, but funds, printing machines, strategic advice. Its soft power could shift the course of nations, but always from behind the curtain. In Latin America too, its influence was undeniable. A file dated 1979 describes the Vatican's quiet involvement in Argentina's dirty war. Bishops sent desperate letters reporting mass abductions, kidnappings of priests, silence in return. One Vatican telegram about Father Carlos Mujica, who was assassinated for siding with the poor, stated, "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." Yet in private, bishops sympathetic to resistance were quietly supported, reassigned, protected. Not declared heroes, only shielded in silence. A different file from Chile during Pinochet's rule reveals the tension even more starkly. Meeting records show Vatican leaders reminding the Chilean regime that the Church is not a refuge for enemies of the state. Yet alongside this, other documents show priests hiding fugitives, and the Vatican requesting they not be punished. Again and again, the Vatican spoke in two voices, one for diplomacy, one for conscience. Even its relationship with the Soviet Union followed this pattern. Though Catholicism was persecuted in the Eastern Bloc, the Vatican kept informal communication open. A 1962 report details a secret meeting in Vienna between a Vatican envoy and a Soviet diplomat. They discussed religious freedom, the safety of clergy. Nothing groundbreaking, but the fact it happened at all meant everything. In the post-war world, the Vatican was not just surviving, it was maneuvering. but its hands were not always clean. During Franco's dictatorship in Spain, the Vatican maintained formal relations for decades. Letters show that while some clergy disagreed, they followed orders from Rome. Then came the financial scandals. The archives hold a hauntingly thick file labeled Caro Calvi. Inside is the story of Roberto Calvi, known as God's banker, found hanging under London's Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. His links to the Vatican Bank, known as IOR, ran deep. Documents within the file detail suspicious loans, connections to shell corporations in Panama, and internal warnings about activities dangerously close to sin. Warnings that were ignored. Even more shocking is the label on several internal memos, destruendum, to be destroyed. And yet, they were not. The Vatican didn't erase its errors. It stored them, not to confess, but perhaps one day to explain. And then came the WikiLeaks scandal, when confidential papers were stolen by the Pope's personal butler and leaked to the public. The archives preserve the full timeline. Gabriel's handwritten confession reads, "I did not betray the Holy Father. I only wanted the Church to know what was happening behind closed doors." Within the leak was a mirror of the modern Vatican: rival factions, hidden finances, ethical breaches in ecclesiastical appointments, and perhaps most hauntingly, a reminder that no fortress is without its cracks. When asked why these records were preserved, one archivist replied, "Because the truth does not belong to us, it only passes through us." That may be the most honest line ever written inside Vatican walls. The deeper one reads, the clearer it becomes. The Vatican does not destroy its ghosts. It archives them, not to forget, but to wait. Sometimes in grief, sometimes in hope. Because in this endless silence between prayer and power, there are stories too fragile to be spoken aloud, stories too dangerous to be misunderstood, and stories that demand not belief, but courage. To most of the world, the Vatican is a cathedral of certainty. But deep within its archives, a different picture emerges, one painted in shadows, silence, and handwritten doubts. In a section marked Sub Secretum Pontificum, under papal secrecy, are records never revealed while their authors still breathed. These aren't confessions. They're confrontations, moments when even popes and cardinals clashed over the soul of the Church. One such confrontation unfolded between Pope Paul VI and Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, a man once considered papabile, a leading candidate for the papacy. Siri was a staunch traditionalist. He opposed modernizing the Church, resisted the use of vernacular languages during Mass, and rejected interfaith dialogue. He wrote a private letter denouncing the reforms of the Second Vatican Council as the dismantling of the sacred. The Pope replied in only 2 lines, "The shepherd cannot wait for the hesitation of the gatekeeper." Nothing more, nothing less. But the cracks went deeper than doctrine. Buried in a folder titled Caro Calvi lies the unraveling of the Vatican Bank scandal, a web of financial deceit that ended with a man hanging from a London bridge. Roberto Calvi, dubbed God's banker, had deep ties to the Vatican's financial operations. Inside the archive is a 600-page dossier, bank statements, letters, wire transfers, each revealing the Vatican's quiet entanglement in global financial corruption. Shell companies in Panama, loans to mafia-linked entities. A handwritten note from a bishop reads, "We are using sacred assets for purposes dangerously close to sin." The response? Silence. The file was labeled destruendum, to be destroyed, but it wasn't. The Vatican kept it, not to confess, not to apologize, but to remember. The scandal wasn't isolated. The WikiLeaks episode brought even more shadows into daylight. In 2012, the personal butler of Pope Benedict XVI leaked hundreds of classified Vatican documents. What the world saw was a fractured church, internal rivalries, power struggles, cover-ups, favoritism in appointments, and scandals that went far deeper than theology. The butler's handwritten confession, now preserved in the archive, ends with this sentence: "I did not betray the Pope. I betrayed the silence." It is a sentence that echoes long after the file is closed. When asked why such damaging material is preserved, one archivist replied with a smile, "Because the truth does not belong to us. It only passes through us." Then there are the files never meant to be opened at all. A section marked "Letters Never Sent" contains handwritten drafts by various popes, emotional, raw, and deeply human. One of the most haunting comes from Pope Benedict XV, written in 1917 during World War I. It's a plea to the leaders of Europe for a ceasefire. The Pope's words tremble with desperation. "Let us not let the thunder of artillery be the last word spoken in our time." But the letter was never mailed. A red note in the margin reads, "No one will listen. And if they do, your holiness will appear weak." That letter was folded, shelved, and forgotten, until someone found it again, a century later. Another document labeled "Reserved for Conclave" contains advice written by one pope for his successor. In 1938, Pope Pius XI warned of growing ties between parts of the German Church and fascist authorities. His memorandum is clear: if we remain silent, history will not speak of our wisdom. It will speak of our complicity. The letter was sealed. He died before he could act on it. The archive holds no judgment, only proof. Proof that power, even divine, comes with unbearable weight. That silence, even strategic, leaves an echo. The brief papacy of John Paul I, only 33 days, left behind its own trail. Some claim he was silenced before he could reform the Church. Conspiracy theories abound. But the Vatican archive tells a simpler, colder truth. Documents show he was preparing sweeping reforms of the Vatican Bank. He underlined one sentence 3 times in his own handwriting: "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." But he never got the chance. He died suddenly. No public investigation followed. A cardinal later wrote, "We will continue the mission, but we must not touch the structural foundations." Then came John Paul II, a beloved figure to millions, but even he left behind private letters steeped in self-doubt. During the height of the abuse scandals, he wrote, "I do not know if I have done enough. Every night I pray not only for forgiveness from God, but from the victims I have never met." His pen was steady, but the weight in those words is unmistakable. Pope Francis, too, left behind drafts never published. One such letter was addressed to a cardinal convicted of abuse. "The sin of an individual does not destroy the Church," he wrote, "but the covering up does." In an attached memo, senior clergy debated the boundaries of forgiveness and accountability. One anonymous note reads, "How much truth can the Church survive before it breaks?" The question remains unanswered. Not far from these files is a section marked Conti Privati Intelligence. It doesn't deal in theology, it deals in espionage. Inside are Vatican communications with the CIA, MI6, Mossad. A 1953 report reveals a CIA agent met with a cardinal in Rome shortly after the coup in Iran. The Vatican was asked to morally support anti-communist operations in the Middle East. The reply: "We do not intervene, but we do not discourage those who defend the sacred." In another memo from 1979, the CIA expressed interest in Pope John Paul II's influence on the growing solidarity movement in Poland. The Vatican's response: "The gospel is not a strategic tool, but we are aware of our role." The Vatican's reach doesn't stop at borders. A file labeled Fraternitas Reservata details secret meetings between senior clergy and Freemason representatives, once forbidden by doctrine. But these encounters, beginning in the late 1960s, were aimed at opening dialogue. No conclusions were reached. But from that point on, Vatican policy shifted from prohibition to quiet tolerance. What's most shocking is that these interactions were never made public, but they were never destroyed. Because in the Vatican's eyes, every conversation, no matter how uncomfortable, belongs to history. Then there are the rituals, recorded, practiced, and locked away. In a drawer labeled Ordo Rituum Conclavis, the manual for papal succession, is a list of steps so precise they seem theatrical. The oath of the secret master of ceremonies is written in code, abbreviated Latin, known only to the inner circle. A margin note reads, "If the oath is broken, every prayer within the sanctuary will lose its virtue." Another document titled Ordo Exequiarum Pontificis Maximi outlines the precise steps to be taken when a pope dies. One passage details the ritual in which the camerlengo knocks 3 times on the pope's chamber door, calling his name in Latin. If there is no response, he declares the Holy Father deceased. It is both procedure and prayer, a rite of passage, a reminder that even the papacy must bow to mortality. Among these rituals lies a black leather-bound book, no title, only a date, April 3rd, 1945. Inside is a never-used emergency protocol for the fall of the Vatican. If the Nazis or the Soviets seized Rome, priests were to seal holy relics, destroy sensitive files, and perform the Benedictio Ultima, the final blessing. It has never been read aloud, but it remains there, waiting. Ritual is not superstition. In the Vatican, ritual is memory. Symbols have power. One secret document catalogues the use of symbols in times of crisis. A red cord across a doorway means theological deliberation. A bottle of dark brown ink, called ink of silence, is used for texts never to be released. Some symbols remain unexplained, their meanings buried with those who use them. And then there's the index. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, was the Church's most potent tool of censorship. Established in 1559, it endured for over 400 years. But what's preserved in the Vatican archive is not just the list, it's the debate. Heated, conflicted, often deeply human. One file from 1907 records a vote on whether to ban Vie de Jésus by Ernest Renard. Theologians argued it portrayed Christ as a mere mortal. One bishop opposed the ban, saying, "If we forbid him, we acknowledge his influence." In the end, it was banned. But the opposition remains in ink. The dissent was preserved. Another folder simply labeled Galileo contains not only the sentence of heresy, but letters of protest, requests for leniency, and finally, in 1992, Pope John Paul II's formal recognition of the Church's mistake. A full circle, written across centuries. But perhaps most surprising is the Vatican's file on cinema. From the 1920s to the 1980s, A division called Cinema Aid reviewed films shown in Catholic countries. Their verdicts weren't always strict. Fellini's La Dolce Vita was deemed secular but emotionally truthful, banned from schools but not from public screening, because to ban it loudly would only increase its appeal. In one curious case, the Vatican reviewed George Orwell's 1984. It wasn't banned. The internal conclusion? It critiques not religious totalitarianism, but secular tyranny. No response necessary. Then came the Da Vinci Code. While church leaders criticized it openly, the Vatican's internal strategy was subtler. "We do not ban it," one report read. "We educate." In 1966, the index was abolished, but its ghost still haunts the shelves, page after page of debates about what the faithful should read, should see, should hear. Because in the Church's mind, censorship is not destruction, it is a delay, a pause until the world is ready. Most people think of the Vatican as a place of prayer, relics, and divine ceremony, but few realize it is also a sovereign state, one with its own courts, laws, and a long record of legal entanglements that rarely make headlines. In a section marked Causae Juridicae, Legal Affairs, I found not theology or ritual, but pages of lawsuits, financial disputes, and internal scandals the Church quietly adjudicated under its own roof. One thick file, bound in aging red leather, documented the legal battles that followed the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. That treaty made the Vatican an independent state, but it also left behind a minefield. Hundreds of churches, monasteries, and properties across Italy, all of them now contested. The Vatican refused to surrender them. One memo reads, "We cannot allow sacred ground to become negotiable property, but neither can we allow it to be nationalized without resistance." Negotiations stretched for years. Papal lawyers scoured ancient deeds, some handwritten in Latin, to prove property rights dating back to the 12th century, and they succeeded. Many Catholic sites across Italy still hold extraterritorial status because of those ancient signatures. But the archives hold far darker records. A section labeled Causae Disciplinae Privatae, confidential disciplinary cases, contains the Vatican's internal files on clergy abuse. The first file I opened was dated 1962. The victim, a child; the accused, a priest with a known history. The Vatican's solution was not dismissal or punishment, but relocation. A typed note reads, "Transfer quietly. Avoid scandal for the community." No warning was given to the next parish, and the abuse continued. File after file, across countries, Ireland, the United States, Argentina, the Philippines, reveals a pattern: avoidance, deflection, internal handling. Letters from victims were often met with silence. Some plead in heartbreaking handwriting, "Please don't pretend nothing happened." Only in the early 2000s did the Vatican begin instituting tougher protocols. New disciplinary procedures were introduced. Bishops were held accountable. Yet the archive reveals that change came slowly and sometimes reluctantly. In a 2010 internal report, one bishop wrote, "We were so afraid of scandal that we forgot who we were supposed to protect." Beyond abuse cases, other files detail international lawsuits, many unresolved. A 1997 case brought by descendants of Jewish families alleged the Vatican held valuables looted by the Nazis. The Church denied involvement, but the file was preserved under the label Reclamations Pendentes, unresolved claims. Then there are the records about Vatican museums and the treasures they hold. Tens of thousands of artifacts from former colonies remain behind glass cases. A petition from the government of Peru requests the return of a ceremonial Incan mask. The Vatican replies, "This artifact is a record of human history. It carries no ownership. It belongs to memory." That line echoes in many responses. No legal resolution, no restitution, but always careful, emotionless words, just enough to deflect the storm. Yet not all the archives are about scandal. Some preserve awe. One section, known only to a few, is called Scriptura Prima, First Writings. It houses the earliest manuscripts of Christian belief, hand-copied Gospels, Bibles written on animal skin, ink made from ash and myrrh. There, I held a copy of the Codex Vaticanus, a Greek Bible from the 4th century. Its Gospel of Mark ends not with the resurrection, but with a line, "And they were afraid." The conclusion most people know today, the appearances of the risen Christ, does not exist in this manuscript. Scholars have long debated, was the ending added later? Nearby, in a cabinet with 3 locks, I found a folder labeled Evangelia Apocrypha, Apocryphal Gospels. Among them were the Gospels of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip. These texts, long dismissed by the Church, are preserved here, not to validate them, but to remember they once existed. The Gospel of Thomas is not a narrative, it's a list of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. One reads, "The kingdom of God is within you and all around you." It doesn't deny Christ, but it bypasses the Church. Perhaps that is why it was never canonized. Another manuscript, the Acts of Pilate, claims to record Pontius Pilate's reflections after sentencing Jesus. He describes Christ as a man whose eyes shone like fire. Was it myth? Propaganda? The Church decided not to destroy it, but to keep it hidden. In a quiet drawer, I found a letter from Pope Damasus II, dated 1055. He writes, "We do not reject these texts for falsehood, but because the hearts of men are not yet ready." That sentence haunts the archive like a breath between 2 locked doors. Then there are the debates. Minutes from the Council of Nicaea in 325 show not just agreements, but arguments. Entire texts were proposed, discussed, and discarded. A Greek scribe notes, "Certain writings are to be preserved for deeper study, not for public reading." That means they weren't destroyed. They were withheld. They may still lie somewhere, sealed in unmarked drawers. The archive does not tell you what to believe. It preserves everything, true, false, forgotten, because it believes truth is found not in certainty, but in memory. And memory includes pain. In one folder labeled Epistulae non missae, letters never sent, are pages written by popes at night, never intended for publication. One was by Pope Benedict XV in 1917, addressed to the monarchs of Europe during the First World War. "If we do not stop," he wrote, "God will abandon both throne and altar." The letter was never sent. A secretary wrote in the margin, "Too weak, it will be ignored." So the paper was folded, shelved, and nearly forgotten. Another folder, Ad Conclave, contains handwritten instructions from popes to their successors. Pope Pius XI wrote a memo in 1938 warning that parts of the German Church have already begun to collaborate with fascism. He urged a future pope not to remain silent, but no action followed. The file was sealed with red wax. Not far from these records lies a quiet room holding transcripts of private meetings between popes and world leaders. One marked USA Res Privata records the 1963 conversation between Pope John XXIII and President John F. Kennedy shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy asked, "Who will blink first?" The Pope responded, "When men no longer speak from faith, they shout from fear." 3 months later, the Pope died. So did Kennedy. The archive does not draw a connection. It doesn't have to. In another folder, dated 1989, Pope John Paul II met with Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was not religious, but he reportedly said, "If we do not change, there will be nothing left to preserve." The Pope answered, "Truth rises when people grow weary." It was one of the first signs the Eastern Bloc was collapsing, not with tanks, but with quiet conversations recorded in ink. Even countries with no deep ties to the Vatican appear in the archive. A 1991 file marked Vietnam, Colloquia non officialia, reveals a meeting in Geneva between a Vatican envoy and Vietnamese officials. There was no agreement, but one line in the memo reads, "After 15 years of silence, one sentence matters more than 10 treaties." The Vatican does not have an army. It doesn't hold elections, but it holds something else: time. Because while governments collapse and borders fade, the Vatican keeps writing and waiting. And sometimes, the waiting leads to something no one expects. In a section labeled Supernaturalis Recensio, Review of the Supernatural, I found no myths, no fantasies. What I found was a rigorous investigative process, hundreds of case files on miracles, apparitions, visions. The 1917 miracle of Fatima in Portugal is preserved in detail. 60 eyewitness accounts, photographs, weather data, and yet the Vatican never declared it an official miracle. A memo simply reads, "Devotion acceptable, belief not required." At Lourdes, France, the Vatican documented the visions of young Bernadette Soubirous in 1858. Doctors interviewed her. Psychologists examined her. The verdict? No signs of deception or illness. But the Virgin Mary she described did not match canonical depictions. So the Vatican didn't validate the vision. It validated the healings that followed, carefully, clinically. In one case from 1973, Akita, Japan, a statue of the Virgin Mary was reported to have wept. Chemical analysis confirmed the tears were human. But the Vatican took no position for over 2 decades. Only after extensive study did it allow limited veneration. Even then, the case was never made official. The archive also holds casu rejecti, rejected cases, statues that wept due to plumbing errors, voices recorded by hidden speakers. One case involved a girl who claimed nightly visions. It turned out her brother had rigged a speaker under her bed. Still, the Vatican does not mock these reports. It preserves them. Because sometimes, even deception reveals truth about fear, about faith, about human longing. In a thin file titled Lux inter Kekos, Light Among the Blind, is a single page, a monk's quiet testimony about seeing a glowing child in the snow. No miracle was claimed, no theology debated. Only this: if someone else sees it, they will not think themselves mad. The Vatican took no action, but the story remains, shelved, silent, waiting. Because here, silence is not avoidance, it is reverence. The Vatican does not declare what is true. It preserves what might be. And sometimes what might be is more powerful than what is. The deeper I went into the archives, the more I understood. This was not just a collection of papers. It was a mirror reflecting the soul of an institution that has lived at the center of power, belief, and human frailty for 2,000 years. One folder, plain and unmarked except for a handwritten title, Relatio non publicata, Fraternitas Reservata, contained records of meetings the Vatican has never officially acknowledged. Quiet dialogues between Vatican officials and representatives of secret societies, including the Freemasons. One entry, dated 1969, details a conversation between a bishop in Switzerland and a high-ranking European Freemason. The topic, human rights, freedom of conscience, and whether common ground could be found. No conclusions were written, no agreements signed. But in the years that followed, Vatican policy shifted from outright condemnation to cautious disengagement. What I found was not conspiracy. It was complexity. The Vatican does not live in isolation. Its fingers reach into diplomacy, finance, art, and human psychology, not to manipulate, but to navigate a world that never stops watching. In a nearby drawer marked Bancaria Potestas, Banking and Power, were hundreds of financial documents, wire transfers, real estate holdings in London and Paris, investments through shell companies in Panama. A 1985 report noted, portion of investment returns redirected to Holy See charitable funds. Public disclosure not required. There was no evidence of theft or corruption, but the opacity was staggering. Some accounts were listed under pastoral foundations, but managed by private banks. Tracing the true beneficiaries was nearly impossible. Perhaps that was the point. And yet, even among these shadows, I found moments of shocking clarity. In a slim black folder marked Ordo Rituum Conclavis, I found the original instructions for organizing a papal conclave, 80 pages, handwritten, not for the public, not for scholars, for a single purpose, to ensure the most sacred transition in Catholicism remains utterly silent. One section details a secret ritual, the oath of the ceremoniere Sigdo, the hidden master of ceremonies sworn to uphold absolute silence during conclave. Only the opening line is visible. I swear before God and the shadow of St. Peter. The rest is written in coded Latin, intelligible only to the inner circle. Another passage describes what happens after a pope dies. Before the public announcement, the camerlengo must knock on the papal chamber door and call the pope's name 3 times in Latin. If no answer comes, he declares the pope deceased. No press, no photo, just words and silence. That silence continues in a small, nearly forgotten book labeled Canonizatio Extraordinaria. It outlines a ritual for the extraordinary canonization of a saint outside the normal process. One rule reads, ceremony must last 3 hours, no more, no less. Why 3 hours? No explanation is given. A separate file, Symbolica non publicata, the non-public symbols, catalogues hidden signs used inside Vatican walls. A red cord across a door signals a doctrinal crisis. A bottle of dark brown ink, called ink of silence, is used to write texts never meant to be read aloud. And then there was the most haunting item of all, a leather-bound book with no title. Just a date, April 3rd, 1945. Inside, a ritual never performed, titled Benedictio Ultima, the final blessing. Prepared in case Rome fell to fascist or Soviet forces, it included instructions for sealing relics, destroying sensitive materials, and a final rite to be performed if Vatican sovereignty was ever completely lost. The blessing was never read, but it waits, preserved beneath 3 brass latches. Not every page was as mystical. In a dusty hallway, I came across a wooden box labeled Index. Inside, the complete history of the Vatican's Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of books the Church once forbade. Established in 1559, this list shaped generations. But what the archive contains is not just a list, it is the debate. Minutes from meetings of the Congregatio pro Doctrina Fidei, the Office for the Doctrine of the Faith, reveal how popes, bishops, and theologians struggled over what ideas were too dangerous for the faithful. 1907. Entry records a discussion over whether to ban Renan's Life of Jesus. Some argued it depicted Christ as merely human. One bishop objected, "If we ban him, we acknowledge his influence." The book was banned, but that argument is still there, in ink. Another file, 300 pages long, holds the complete record of Galileo Galilei's trial. Not just the verdict, but letters from bishops opposing the condemnation, handwritten pleas for leniency, and a transcript of Pope John Paul II's 1992 statement acknowledging the Church's error. A line from 1633 reads, "We do not condemn science. We condemn the arrogance that seeks to rise above revelation." That line still echoes today, etched not in marble, but in paper. Next to that, a file labeled Cinema Ed contains the Church's internal reviews of films between the 1920s and 1980s. A review of Fellini's La Dolce Vita reads, "Excessively secular, but accurately portrays the emptiness of a world without God." Conclusion: banned in Catholic schools, but not publicly condemned. A loud ban, the note says, would only increase its appeal. Another folder tracks the Church's reaction to George Orwell's 1984. The concern wasn't about anti-religious messaging, but whether people would mistake secular totalitarianism for religious metaphor. Their response? No action needed. Then came a folder labeled Dan Brown, internal circulation only. It detailed the Vatican's internal review of the Da Vinci Code. While many priests publicly criticized the book, internal memos agreed. Its danger lies not in its ideas, but in how little the public understands our rituals. Their response? Don't condemn. Educate. In 1966, the index was officially abolished. But its ghost still lives in those drawers. Quiet, watchful, waiting. Just like the Crusades. When I opened the drawer labeled Crusata, the air itself seemed to change. Gone were the typewritten notes. Here, everything was parchment and wax. The first document was Pope Urban VII's original Crusade bull from 1095. It begins, "The Holy Land has been seized. The blood of the faithful cries from Jerusalem." There is no mention of land or gold. Only urgency. Only God. But within decades, the tone shifted. Letters from later popes, including Innocent III, reveal the transformation of the Crusades from spiritual mission to political campaign. Logistics, supplies, taxation, rewards, all carefully planned. One letter to a European lord asks how many knights he can supply and whether he will seize the property of non-believers. A Vatican reply approves the plan. A particularly chilling record is from 1204, after the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, a Christian city. A Vatican scribe notes, "We let the sword lead, not the spirit. We looted our brethren." The Pope's condemnation was tepid. No reparations were made, no apology ever followed. Later documents include lesser-known crusades against pagans in the Baltics, against the Cathars in France, and even against Christian monarchs who defied Rome. In a 13th century trial record, a bishop refuses to join a crusade. His reason? "I do not see God in fire and blood." He was stripped of office, but time softened even that. In a file labeled Reconciliatio, I found 20th century letters between the Vatican and Orthodox leaders from Greece, Russia, and Armenia, still wounded by those wars. In 1999, Pope John Paul II wrote to Patriarch Bartholomew, "If blood once divided us, let prayer begin to mend the wounds." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning, and it taught me something. This archive, this immense, dusty, sacred library, does not pretend the Church is perfect. It does not hide that mistakes were made or that faith was once wielded like a sword. What it preserves is memory, because to the Vatican, memory is sacred, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. On one rainy afternoon, I wandered into a section I'd never seen before. A wooden drawer labeled Mulieres in Silentio Ecclesiae, women in the silence of the Church. Inside, handwritten letters from Hildegard of Bingen, composer, nun, visionary. One letter to Pope Eugenius III reads, "The soul of a woman is also breathed into being by God. Why must her voice pass only through the mouths of men?" He did not condemn her. He did not reply. In another folder, labeled Scriptura Monalium, I found poems, prayers, and liturgical texts written by nuns between the 9th and 16th centuries. One prayer read, "I do not ask to be priest. I ask to tend the flame unseen, burning quietly in the darkest chapel corner." These texts were never part of official liturgy, but they were copied and shared, passed from nun to nun, their ink faded, but still visible. In a 1321 Inquisition file, a woman named Clara is asked, "Do you believe a woman can interpret the word of God?" She replies, "If God chose a virgin to bear him, why would he not choose her tongue to proclaim him?" She was burned at the stake, yet her words remain. Later files show slow change. Vatican II included women as theological advisors. In a 2016 memo, a female theologian presents evidence that the early Church recognized deaconesses. One cardinal writes in response, "If a truth must be hidden because our structure cannot contain it, the fault is not in the truth." The Vatican archives do not erase these women, but they haven't brought them into the light either. They remain like footnotes in the margins, quiet but unshaken. And that is the paradox of this place. It is both silent and filled with voices. It is sacred and yet deeply human. It preserves miracles and failures. And perhaps that is why the Vatican doesn't release all of this to the world, because it knows the truth is not clean. It's not easy. It's not black and white. It's memory, messy, unfinished, painful, beautiful, and maybe that's the kind of truth worth preserving. The Vatican is often described as a sanctuary of faith, a symbol of moral clarity in a chaotic world. But step beyond the stained glass, beneath the marble halls, into the deepest layers of its archives, and a different picture begins to emerge. Here, in a section labeled Dea Reservata, Reserved Crimes, I found files that stunned me, not because they were sensational, but because they were cold, clinical, and devastatingly human. One file details a 1969 theft from the Vatican's Sacred Relic Vault. A young monk had taken a small box believed to contain the remains of St. Lawrence. Not to sell. He said the relic spoke to him in dreams. No prosecution followed. Instead, he was laicized and quietly expelled. A single line closes the file. Misdirected faith, not malice. Mercy prevails. But not every case was so simple. A 1982 file labeled Castel AG 82 recorded the murder of a teenage boy, a Vatican citizen, within the gardens, not far from the papal residence. The suspect, a gatekeeper, with a history of mental illness. The investigation ran over 400 pages. Yet instead of handing him over to Italian authorities, the Vatican confined him to a remote monastery. The reasoning? Preserve the peace of the faithful above the curiosity of the crowd. The Vatican's legal system is based on Codex Juris Canonici, canon law. But since 1929, parts of Italian civil law apply selectively, and in practice, jurisdiction remains with Vatican judges, often high-ranking clergy. In one case from 2010, a bishop candidly wrote, "We were so afraid of scandal, we forgot who we were meant to protect." In another file, I read internal records from 2009 to 2011 investigating money laundering through Vatican bank accounts. Transfers from the Opus account to an institution in Liechtenstein were flagged as suspicious. No charges were filed, but shortly after, the bank director resigned. There was no announcement, just a note. We choose to carry the wound rather than expose it. And then there was Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old Vatican citizen who vanished in 1983. Her disappearance became one of Italy's most enduring mysteries. The archives file, labeled Reservatissimo, was sealed. I was allowed to read only a handful of pages from 1985. One memo noted the Vatican received an anonymous letter stating Emanuela was alive and being held as part of a political negotiation. There was no response. One cardinal wrote, "If false, a reply invites chaos. If true, silence is our last hope." The case remains unresolved, and that's the nature of this archive. It's not a courtroom. It doesn't issue verdicts, but it remembers everything, especially the parts that institutions would rather forget. In a distant basement vault, marked Deposito Pittorico Riservato, reserved painting repository, I encountered a different kind of silence. These were works of art the Vatican had chosen not to display. The first item I examined was a charcoal sketch by Michelangelo, a figure reaching not toward light, but away from it. A handwritten note beneath read, "Not destined for the chapel, too human." Nearby was an oil painting attributed to Raphael. It showed a visibly pregnant woman holding a crucifix, presumed to be the Virgin Mary. A faded annotation read, "May cause doctrinal confusion, not to be displayed." Another painting, unsigned but believed to be Caravaggio, depicted St. Peter not as a saint, but a weary fisherman, dirty and doubtful, gripping a torn net. There was no halo, no miracle, just struggle. That, too, was hidden. In a section marked Iconographia Contestata, contested iconography, I found African and Asian renditions of the Virgin Mary created by local missionaries. One 1911 Vatican memo noted, "Diversity is divine, but uniformity protects sanctity." None of those statues were ever placed on altars. A file labeled Modernus Ars recorded rejected collaborations with artists like Salvador Dalí, Francis Bacon, and Ai Weiwei. Dalí had proposed a surreal series on the saints. The Vatican declined. "Sacred imagery," one note reads, "must not become metaphor." Still, the Vatican preserved every piece. They were not hidden to be destroyed. They were hidden because they posed a question. What does holiness really look like? And is beauty allowed to be uncomfortable? But not all forgotten treasures are artistic. In a metal drawer labeled Specula Vaticana, the Vatican Observatory, I found records that told a story few would believe. The Vatican operates one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world. Since the 17th century, Jesuit scientists have recorded everything from comets and eclipses to mysterious lights in the sky. A notebook dated 1610, belonging to Jesuit astronomer Christopher Clavius, includes a line: "The stars are not chaos. They are signs of an order we do not yet understand." In the Galileo file, I discovered a 36-page mathematical argument written by clerics defending geocentrism. In a margin, one priest asks, "Should we not wonder why Scripture is silent on centrifugal force?" In another folder, I found a draft of an unreleased 1741 document from Pope Benedict XIV, proposing Galileo's rehabilitation. It was never published, but it was never destroyed. By the 20th century, the Vatican began funding scientific expeditions. A 1935 report details a trip to Africa to observe a solar eclipse. "Faith," the Vatican wrote, "does not fear the dark. It measures it." In the same drawer were letters from the Vatican to NASA during the Apollo era. One, dated 1962, to President Kennedy reads, "We pray for those who dare to leave Adam's sky to witness the Creator's work from without." When Apollo 11 succeeded, the Vatican made no public spectacle. But in Pope Paul VI's private journal, one line was recorded: "Today, man did not only gaze at the heavens, he touched them." In 1990, physicist Stephen Hawking wrote to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences questioning whether God was necessary in the universe's origin. The Vatican's response? A theologian scribbled a line: "If God exists only in the gaps, then he is not eternal." That line was never published, but it remains clear, honest, daring. Because what I realized, standing in that archive of starlight, was this: true faith doesn't fear science. It invites it to look deeper. In the final hall I visited, Res Diplomatic ex Oriente et Borea, were the Vatican's diplomatic record with non-Christian empires: Ottoman, Qing, Tokugawa, Soviet, and others. 1584 letter from Sultan Murad III to Pope Gregory XIII addressed him as leader of those who believe in the three-in-one God. It proposed mutual respect for sacred spaces in Jerusalem. The Vatican replied, "Where peace opens a path to prayer, the sword is unnecessary." In 1713, a meeting took place in Macau between the Vatican and Qing officials. The emperor's court was open to dialogue, but rejected the suppression of Chinese ancestral rites. The Vatican's response: withdraw the ban only if doctrine is unharmed. No agreement, but the door remained ajar. In a sealed file titled Negotiatio cum Moscovia, I found a record of secret Vatican overtures to the Russian Tsars. A letter from Pope Pius IX to Tsar Alexander II read, "When the throne seeks eternity, it must listen to the eternal throne." The letter received no reply. Another file documented a 1954 Vatican envoy's trip to North Vietnam. The report: priests celebrating Mass in silence, vestments hidden beneath plain clothes. Faith here makes no noise, but it has not died. And tucked inside a folder titled Via Pacis, the Path of Peace, were the complete transcripts of Vatican-United Nations relations since 1945. A 1965 Vatican note reads, "We have no vote, no army, but we may whisper to the conscience of the world." That is how the Vatican endures, not by domination, not by certainty, but by waiting and by writing. Which brings me to one of the most sacred and strangest parts of the archive: Res Supernaturalis Recensio, the review of supernatural phenomena. Thousands of reports, interviews, photos, medical evaluations, all filed like forensic evidence. Fatima, Lourdes, Akita, All are here. All are treated with the same process: skepticism and hope. A 1930 Fatima memo reads, 60 witnesses interviewed. No camera distortion. Accounts consistent. Theological conclusion: acceptable for devotion, not binding for belief. That phrase appears again and again: acceptable but not binding. The Vatican doesn't chase miracles. It investigates them like crime scenes. One file about a weeping statue includes a chemical analysis. The result? Verifiable moisture. Source unexplained. Monitoring to continue. In another file, a claim of healing after prayer to Pope John Paul II. Verified by doctors. Still, the Vatican wrote, observation period must continue. 5 more years. They do not rush. They do not condemn. And sometimes they do not explain. One file, titled Lux Inter Caecos, Light Among the Blind, includes a handwritten testimony by a Swiss monk who claimed to see a glowing child in the snow. No evidence, no follow-up, just one line. Silence is the only way to preserve the sacred. And perhaps that is what the archive really is. Not a storehouse of answers, but a temple of silence. A place where time holds truth gently in its arms until we are ready to hear it. I did not find treasure in the Vatican. I found questions, and the courage to leave some of them unanswered, because truth, real truth, is not a revelation. It is a slow unfolding, like light moving across ancient stone.